Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 13th chapter of the third book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, its title being Strategic Reserve. The text follows. A reserve has two objects which are very distinct from each other, namely, first, the prolongation and renewal of the combat, and secondly, for use in case of unforeseen events. The first object implies the utility of a successive application of forces, and on that account cannot occur in strategy. Cases in which a corps is sent to succor a point which is supposed to be about to fall are plainly to be placed in the category of the second object, as the resistance which has to be offered here could not have been sufficiently foreseen. But a corps which is destined expressly to prolonged combat with that object in view is placed in rear, would be only a corps placed out of reach of fire, but under the command and in the disposition of the general commanding in the action, and accordingly would be a tactical and not a strategic reserve. But the necessity for a force ready for unforeseen events may also take place in strategy, and consequently there may also be a strategic reserve, but only where unforeseen events are imaginable. In tactics, where the enemy's measures are generally first ascertained by direct sight, and where they may be concealed by every wood, every fold of undulating ground, we must naturally always be alive, more or less, to the possibility of unforeseen events, in order to strengthen subsequently those points which appear too weak, and in fact to modify generally the disposition of our troops, so as to make it correspond better to that of the enemy. Such cases must also happen in strategy, because the strategic act is directly linked to the tactical. In strategy also many a measure is first adopted in consequence of what is actually seen, or in consequence of uncertain reports arriving from day to day, or even from hour to hour, and lastly from the actual results of the combats. It is, therefore, an essential condition of strategic command that, according to the degree of uncertainty, forces must be kept in reserve against future contingencies. In the defensive generally, but particularly in the defense of certain obstacles of ground, like rivers, hills, etc., such contingencies, as is well known, happen constantly. But this uncertainty diminishes in proportion as the strategic activity has less of the tactical character, and ceases almost altogether in those regions where it borders on politics. The direction in which the enemy leads his columns to the combat can be perceived by actual sight only. Where he intends to pass a river is learned from a few preparations which are made shortly before. The line by which he proposes to invade our country is usually announced by all the newspapers before a pistol shot has been fired. The greater the nature of the measure, the less it will take the enemy by surprise. Time and space are so considerable, the circumstances out of which the action proceeds so public and little susceptible of alteration, that the coming event is either made known in good time, or can be discovered with reasonable certainty. On the other hand, the use of a reserve in this province of strategy, even if one were available, will always be less efficacious the more the measure has a tendency towards being one of a general nature. We have seen that the decision of a partial combat is nothing in itself, but that all partial combats only find their complete solution in the decision of the total combat. But even this decision of the total combat has only a relative meaning of many different gradations, according as the whole force which the victory has been gained forms a more or less great and important part of the whole. The lost battle of a corps may be repaired by the victory of the army. Even the lost battle of an array may not be only counterbalanced by the gain of a more important one, but converted into a fortunate event, the 2 days of Kulm, August 29 and 30, 1813. No one can doubt this, but it is just as clear that the weight of each victory, the successful issue of each total combat, is so much the more substantial, the more important the part conquered, and that therefore the possibility of repairing the loss by subsequent events diminishes in the same proportion. In another place we shall have to examine this more in detail. It suffices for the present to have drawn attention to the undubitable existence of this progression. If we now add lastly to these two considerations the third, which is that if the persistent use of forces in tactics always shifts the great result to the end of the whole act, the law of the simultaneous use of the forces in strategy, on the contrary, lets the principal result, which need not to be the final one, take place almost always at the commencement of the great or whole act, then in these three results we have more ground sufficient to find strategic reserves always more superfluous, always more useless, always more dangerous, the more general their destination. The point where the idea of a strategic reserve begins to become inconsistent is not difficult to determine. It lies in the supreme decision. Employment must be given to all the forces within the space of the supreme decision. In every reserve active force available, which is only intended for use after the decision is opposed to common sense. If therefore tactics has in its reserves the means of not only meeting unforeseen dispositions on the part of the enemy, but also repairing that which never can be foreseen, the result of the combat should be that unfortunate. Strategy, on the other hand, must, at least as far as relates to the capital result, renounce to the use of these means. As a rule, it can only repair the losses sustained at one point by advantages gained at another, in a few cases by moving troops from one point to another. The idea of preparing for such reverses by placing forces in reserve beforehand can never be entertained in strategy. We have pointed out as an absurdity the idea of a strategic reserve which is not to cooperate in the capital result, and as it is so beyond a doubt, we should not be led into such an analysis as we have made in these two chapters, where it's not that, in the disguise of other ideas, it looks like something better and frequently makes its appearance. One person sees in it the acme of strategic sagacity and foresight. Another rejects it, and with it the idea of any reserve, consequently even of a tactical one. This confusion of ideas is transferred to real life, and if we would see a memorable instance of it, we have only to call to mind that Prussia, in 1806, left a reserve of 20,000 men cantoned in the Mark under Prince Eugene of Württemberg, which could not be possibly reach the Saale in time to be of any use, and that another force of 25,000 men belonging to this power remained in East and South Prussia, destined only to be put on a war footing afterwards as a reserve. After these examples, we cannot be accused of having been fighting with windmills. So this is an important chapter in which von Clausewitz completes the thoughts that he had expressed in the previous two relatively to the concept of reserve, of concentration of troops in time and space, right? And how this should operate differently in strategy and in tactics. And we have seen fundamentally that, and look at the previous videos if you want to get the extended explanation and demonstration, because this is actually what the Vom Kriege works like. However, that in tactics, as a fresh force can be fundamentally really make a difference over a worn out one. The concept of reserve is actually very, very positive, right? It works on many occasions, not always, but it's feasible, and it's used all throughout military history. In strategy, conversely, where your troops are fundamentally all in one piece, and the result of a battle can essentially overwhelm the other troops that can arrive from engaging at that point another battle, and therefore splitting them being weaker, well, the thing doesn't practically work, right? As strategy works as if, your troops were, disposable, strategically speaking, works with your troops already regrouped, reformed, retrained, and capable of being brought once again back in combat, right, in battle. So the problem of being shattered at that point before the battle, that does not exist, right? So that happens just in the moment in which from strategy that transfers into tactics. That is not to say that also in strategy there are not other factors that can worn out the troops, but strategically speaking, the best move is to concentrate troops all together, right? When the decisive, the principal decision has to be taken in that regard, and now we'll see it better. So, strategic reserve. Von Clausewitz writes, a reserve has two objects which are very distinct from each other, namely, first, the prolongation and renewal of the combat, and secondly, for use in case of the unforeseen events, right? So there's a double nature of it. So the first one is, you decide that you want fundamentally to maintain a certain amount of troops to revive the combat in certain specific, situations, for reasons that can have to do even with disengagement, and all what brought you to fight at that point, and or to cope with unforeseen events that are always to emerge fundamentally in a situation. Therefore, you want to leave some troops to be able to cope with them. And von Clausewitz says the first object implies the utility of a successive application of forces, and on that account cannot occur in strategy, for what we have seen before. Because this successive application of forces basically functions when the enemy is worn out, right? But this doesn't happen strategically speaking. That happens when, the enemy is just beating combat. Therefore, you're not disposing of strategy, but of tactics. Then when the fight is over, the thing reverts back to strategy. That has to play now, again, with troops that, are essentially employable again for another combat. So they have, being reorganized, refilled with supplies, with equipment, right, and respirited, and so on. And the fact that you can have control on those troops is the very aspect of what, the transitions from tactics to strategy, right? Because those troops may flee in combat, but they will at some point gather, hopefully, at another point. When that happens, if it happens, well, you can dispose of them strategically. This is the difference. Then von Clausewitz writes, cases in which a corps is sent to succor a point which is supposed to be all about to fall are plainly to be placed in the category of the second object, right, as the resistance which has to be offered here could not have been sufficiently foreseen. Someone besieging your forces somewhere, detachment, and you didn't foresee that, so you need to hurry up to go save that garrison. Fine, so that's a strategical move. But a corps, von Clausewitz writes, which is destined expressly to prolong the combat and with that object in view is placed in rear, would be only a corps placed out of reach of fire, but under the command and at the disposition of the general command in the action, and accordingly would be a tactical and not a strategic reserve. That is to say, once again, if you have to come to aid to that garrison, what matters there, you send troops on force, right? Because it's, having them there that it can cause strategically something interesting, like, the enemy leaves the siege, or anyway, the troops inside can attempt a sortie with you, etc. But how this gonna eventually translate itself into combat, and therefore when you will decide whether to commit or not enough troops at the moment in combat and leave a reserve, well, at that point it's a tactical problem, because at that point you're measuring the effect that combat will have made on those troops, and therefore not something that belongs to tactics, because you count to intervening time essentially to have an effect on the worn out enemy, right? And whereas if you get you don't act, the enemy resupplies and everything, the thing is projected once again at a strategical level, and that you have to redescend into a tactical one where the enemy is fundamentally as if he hadn't fought that one, because he has rested and everything. But you understand how the two things can intertwine at some level. Like, it's difficult to exactly, like, the point is this, that conceptually speaking, strategy and tactics are always there, right? They don't magically, leave actually the point to one another. But there is a moment, we've seen it in the previous chapters, in which fundamentally one takes over the other, right? The tactics, in combat, once you have committed your troops to battle, like either you disengage, but it's still a tactical thing, right? Or you cannot withdraw magically that army from the field, just as if you had that was a strategic decision on the map, right? Vice versa, when those troops are gathered again, after they have fought or either they have won or lost, that when you can redispose of them, that's strategy, and that operates, as we've seen, always in function of tactics, but it takes over where combat fundamentally is not going on, right? And the two things can happen all the time, right? So assume your troops are marching, and an airplane comes, shooting at the column march, right? That's essentially a strategical move. The plane, can cause some scramble and counteraction, but fundamentally, you have to, employ your divisions to go stop that enemy that is marching against you on force. So it's just, a banal example, but just to make you understand how the two things can get intertwined. But there is always kind of a prevalence of one factor or the other, depending on also at which level we're talking about, right? And it's obvious that the more we rise up through the ranks, and the least, that combat actually has a meaning on the overall thing, right? At least in the moment in which is going on, right? Because at that point you have, if there is a major engagement, you have decided, and it's going on its own, right? It's not strategy at that point it decides, it's tactics. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, but the necessity for a force ready for unforeseen events may also take place in strategy, and consequently there may also be a strategic reserve, but only where unforeseen events are imaginable, right? This is not to say that strategy cannot make use of reserves. Guess why? Because you don't know most of the times what is happening in front of you. So what you're doing in that sense is not really preparing your forces in a reserve sense, thinking that your fresh troops that you're disposing of are more effective in their employment just because you have put them away from the front line. That's because someone could, surround you, outflank you, something like that. You may not expect it, so you need these troops to be employed to cover that gap. But whether you make them intervene before or after, that's just a strategic problem. It has not to do with combat in itself, because that eventually will break out when the units will collide, right? And that's a wholly different aspect. And once again, this is not to say that for example, a very long march doesn't have an effect on the troops overall, that the military aspects are tied to, the ones for the art of war are tied to many others, like logistics and supplies, etc. But we can assume that after all armies are functioning virtually in the same way, right? That in military history, you don't really find much of a difference in terms of what an army is supplied like, and even if that's a problem, there's not much you can do in terms. If you're moving an army, that's either gonna move or not gonna move, right? And if you have enough means to make it move, the troops will fundamentally respond in the same way. We don't have troops that is better supplied, right? There's not a dramatic difference after all. Then in combat, maybe there will be, but not in, let's say, in a march most of the times. But even if that has not definitely an impact, and von Clausewitz, you remember, has made the point that the more warfare advances, the more resources are committed, and the more on this scale, these smaller factors become meaningless, right? And this is true, in fact, from if you reasoning in terms of what happens at the strategical level and at a tactical level. At a strategical level, everything homogenizes much more than it happens at a tactical one, right? That's the same reason for which, in tactics, reserves do work, because it literally makes a difference whether, a unit has already fought and is out of ammo and tired and exhausted and so on, and and another is fresh. At the strategical level, the thing blends together, and you can't basically even distinguish that point. So yeah, there are reserves also in strategy, right? Then von Clausewitz writes, In tactics, where the enemy's measures are generally first ascertained by direct sight, and where there may be a concealed by every wood, every fold of undulating ground, must naturally always be alive, more or less, to the possibility on foreseen events in order to strengthen subsequently those points which appear too weak, and in fact to modify generally the disposition of our troops so as to make it correspond better to that of the enemy. This is also very important. It has a spatial dimension, right? You may never know where the enemy is in a terrain that is quite articulated and that is not approximate like the one you see on a map on a larger scale, because on a smaller scale actually, that because at that point all those terrain features fundamentally flatten, right? They're gonna have an impact, they're gonna have an influence, but it's diluted. It becomes more homogeneous, as we were saying before. Instead, in tactics, not only there is this more complex realization of what can happen at the moment on the basis of this changes in time and in energy, etc., but also the deployment of troops is generally more complex, is less is more random, we could say. Whereas in strategy, what you're doing of course also follows the terrain, the ground, say better, but after all, if you have to deploy a division, that's just a matter of saying, yeah, lots of elements that can sustain, for example, that division, that ground, but that's not properly the dispositive task of the art of war per se. That has more to do with other factors that even transcend the the military one. But I don't know, a division in a flatland or on a hilly ground, after all, yes, it's gonna change something, but it's still the division is gonna be deployed more or less in the same way, with the same logic, with the same expectations, right? In tactics, the thing is very different, because here we see literally every spot that you can't fully scope could be, I don't know, the nest of an ambush, for example, and as a consequence, you have to complicate the way your troops at your disposals interact, right? And this can be very, very complicated. Like tactics is actually simpler than strategy at so many levels, but dispositionally speaking, what the picture you get is more it's more random than it usually seems, and even in there the deployment requires a much greater creativity and an orthodoxy that, however, is so just in appearance, right? Because actually, tactics has its own logics that are much more free of intuition in order to be solved. In fact, Clausewitz here says, if you look at an army on the field, you can't fundamentally see what it's up to, right? So it doesn't take this enormous understanding. In strategy, instead, as we've seen in previous chapters, most of the factors are unseen. So in a way, what we are doing is, as we'll see better now, is flattening everything down, also in the way you dispose of these troops by the foe, because after all, you can't even sort out those factors that it's even useless, because nor you are capable of fully doing it, the enemy nor is capable of fully doing it, and the larger your units are, and let's say the least surprise also that there will be towards the enemy, and therefore all works in appearance much more simply, right? But even if the problem behind is much bigger, right? So there is this back and forth and asymptotic view of how these two dimensions work. Then von Clausewitz writes, such cases must also happen in strategy, right? Because the strategic act is directly linked to the tactical, as we have seen before. So also in strategy, you may say, okay, how do I cope with the situation? Where do I know the enemy is coming from? How many troops does it dispose in this area? And how to... So the thing complicates there as well. Hell, it does, right? In strategy, von Clausewitz writes, also many a measure is first adopted in consequence of what is actually seen, or in consequence of uncertain reports arriving from day to day, or even from hour to hour, and lastly from the actual results of the combats. It is therefore an essential condition of strategic command that according to the degree of uncertainty, forces must be kept in reserve against future contingencies, right? So it's clear, right? Even in there, if you don't know what you have in front of you, you have to stay prepared. You have to keep troops in a way can cover all this, a broader scenario that can open from a moment to another. But it's not a matter of, calculating that in the sense of now we'll have, spare forces that will eventually overwhelm the enemy after he has fought against, my other units there. No, because your units there is strategic level where they're going to be wiped out. There's not much you can do about that, right? Even if strategically speaking you can come and counter that, but still the engagement is in two different moments, and therefore, in that sense, the scattering of forces is fundamentally more risky, right? And that's where big strategic problems can happen. And as we've seen, the strategic problems are by far the most important, after all. Then von Clausewitz writes, in the defensive generally, but particularly in the defense of certain obstacles of ground like rivers, hills, etc., such contingencies, as is well known, happen constantly. Yeah, I mean, how many front lines were, along, rivers, ridges, etc. I mean, certain natural obstacles that, favored usually the defensive, and I will see the importance that the defensive in this. Actually, no, von Clausewitz has just stated it, right? This is mostly, it has not much to do with the offensive, because the offensive says, you want to attack, fine, we're going to do it anyway, right? Even if it's risky, it's, once we are committed to this, we don't have to lose time, right? Because even if, attacking over this ridge appears very risky, but still, if we wait more, the worse we'll get. So either we do it or we don't, right? So this idea of disposing of a strategic reserve is mostly due to the idea that you're fundamentally at least idling in some way, or at least you expect to be attacked by someone who has the initiative at that point. And that therefore you have to cope with in a defensive sense. If you're attacking, as we'll see now in strategy, you have to commit all your forces, and even if it was the wrong call, you must bet everything on it, because otherwise the thing may fail. We will see. We have already seen how the odds in war are always very tense toward being more balanced, right? Are morally chiefly, but also materially, and therefore. You shouldn't waste troops, as we will see at the end, with the example of Prussia, for example, in 1806, right, when the country was defeated, because they had left these strategic reserves that were of no use, and that while the armies were defeated at Vienna and Auerstedt, right, and this is and where those reserves might have actually helped, right? So they were useless in many ways. And von Clausewitz says, but this uncertainty in the strategic dimension diminishes in proportion as the strategic activity has less of the tactical character, right? And ceases almost together in those regions where it borders on politics, right? When you're commanding an army corps, you don't really wonder very much whether the enemy is. You already know, right? And the same goes more when the war reverts to its commander, its political mandate, right? Where politics is committing those armed forces for something that eventually sees much more clearly in general, also in the broader struggle between the forces, between the polities involved. But if you're a company commander, let's assume, or just a divisional commander, the thing is more complex, because you may actually not know where the enemy is in the range of tens of kilometers. The thing can be more easy to spot, definitely, than if you're a company commander or a platoon commander, where you really know less, right? You have the advantage of looking the thing from the field, so getting something clear at the moment, but really not knowing what there is behind the horizon or behind the next ridge, right? But the larger the forces you're employing are, and the least surprise in general you will meet, right? Because also the enemy is countering you with forces that are kind of equal in this regard, because otherwise, he can't scatter them if you have them all concentrate, because you can't take the enemy out one by one at that point. So there's always a need to increase forces in wherever the enemy is coming, and therefore at that level there is much less of a surprise than there is for smaller units that are fighting against each other. So everything in a way is, as we were saying before, on the outside in strategy it gets down to simpler elements, right? Strategic decisions are more simple per se, right? It's not that they are easier to take, but they're more simpler. I mean, it's not that much you have to do with an army corps. Either you advance or you defend. There ain't much behind that. A company commander has to really think, more sharply, but still at a smaller scale. And that's where this apparent contradiction, paradox, let's say better. It's really not a contradiction, but its slightest paradox really shows actually the reality of war. And von Clausewitz makes this clear with very nice examples, because he says the direction in which the enemy leads his columns to the combat can be perceived by actual sight only, right? Where he intends to pass a river is learned from a few preparations which are made shortly before. The line by which he proposes to invade our country is usually announced by all the newspapers before a pistol shot is being fired, right? So this is very important. Like on the field of battle, you see where's the enemy heading. You see the columns directed towards, somewhere, and you say, okay, they're going there, right? If you wonder whether the enemy is going to cross a bridge, there are a few things you can start observing in the area. Scouts, certain engineers, etc. You have an idea. If a state is going to attack yours, I mean, that's not a thing that you. Oops, I forgot about it. I didn't know, it caught me by surprise. Like that doesn't happen historically speaking. Everything is foreseen before, and even when you actually catch someone by surprise, it's not much of a real surprise in that regard. It's just maybe operationally speaking how the thing is carried out to increase a bit of that in that direction. But it was not really something unknown. That's what we have intelligence for. That's what we have what communications for, right? It's fundamentally it. And always remember that a war is not the product of one sudden spark, right? Von Clausewitz, this thing, as these wars, were, unleashed from second to another. This is what the media, to sell more news to the gullible, will like to make you think, we're always one step ahead to World War III. Like in 1983, maybe we were. Now we are definitely not, right? So these things do not happen in reality. There is an enormous elements of things at stake, and we should be learning, if anything, as citizens, as political beings, to understand what is actually more likely by sheer scale to happen in this war than what is not. Most people have literally no idea about this because they care only about their tiny space and nothing else. So they get alarmed and they're easily, in fact, gullible and exploitable, and very easy to manipulate in this regard. So just reading Vom Kriege it actually makes you feel more tranquil about the whole thing about war after all, right? Which is an enormous deal because nobody is really tranquil about war per se. But that's really the point. And also that this is a very important historical consideration as well, because it makes you understand that wars are unlike what we have been told. Not just the evil guy decides one day to invade another country. Like there is generally a whole country that wants to invade another whole country. This has to do also a lot with collective responsibility. Right, it's not like in the Puritanic fictions in which there's the evil tyrant and all the poor angels at the bottom of society that are sent to war. No, they're just a bunch of motherfuckers that want to scorch other people alive just because they're racist or nationalist and want to invade, or imperialist or something else, and they're being bred with that delusion, and they're simply positive about saying, okay, let's go with boots on this ground and simply take whatever we want. Right, this is the reality of history. It's not the evil guy, that the evil guy is just directing at the top of a mass of potential murderers that really own an enormous collective responsibility. So the myth, the bullshit of the poor gentle-hearted soldier that is sent to war forcibly by the terrible dictator, that has no fault, poor dear, because he's just a poor soldier fighting for his country, is utter garbage, frankly. And we should erase this kind of self-complacent and, in fact, apologetic attitude. That it would be. I never talked about these things openly, but let's be honest. We are really like that. Look at what we are retelling. Let's say in popular culture, World War II like, right? History in the academies writes things that are pretty clear. The masses have literally no idea of what that really is, and they're flipping the whole thing. Right, they're trying to rehabilitate certain countries, certain political entities, so just for saying, but after all, that's unfortunately the world we live in, and it goes on and on and on. And this is an anti-Clausewitzian, hence an anti-real way of thinking war, and reveals anything the political, civical, historical illiteracy of the masses that unfortunately still so in 2020, even in the Western world, are really grossly underschooled and undereducated, and have literally no idea what they talk about most of the times. But aside from this, von Clausewitz exposes here what we were talking about before, relatively to the fact that there is much less of a surprise, generally speaking, when the greater actions are involved. Right, so always remember, war doesn't break out all of a sudden, right? It's a political act, and politics guides it, and it's a political decision, purely and merely, by definition. And therefore, there are ways, this is useful, of course, because it gives, on a broader scale, time to prepare, and that's also why wars are difficult, generally speaking, because remember the odds we were talking about before. That's the point. There is. Countries that go at war against each other. It's not because they, once again, they suddenly decided, so found themselves in that situation. They more or less had enough time to prepare, and therefore the forces that are fielding that have to be counted mostly in a moral sense, and just secondly in a material one, are tend to counterbalance, right, and therefore to create a greater symmetry, and therefore a less predictable outcome of the war than the one that you may think. That's why the usual thing of David versus Goliath is actually so that David can also lose, by the way, because aside from a strictly military point of view, when you enter the field of politics, well, then it becomes really very difficult to even tell who's there, who's actually Goliath and who's actually David, right? Because of everything, right? Look at Vietnam during the war. Was it Vietnam? Well, it wasn't just Vietnam. It was China. It was Russia, right? And in there, the thing gets much more balanced, and if you wonder how it happened, right, it's not guerrilla, right, the issue, it's not the tactical element. That's what unfortunately we're obsessed with in the West, right, this idea that, I don't know in the rest of the world, but frankly in the West, that, man, you can't do anything against guerrilla, right, just a guy having a musket in his hand in every house, and can't fit all the greatest armies. Yeah, that's the thing. No, sorry, it doesn't work like that. And historically speaking, much less than you think. What really happens in those scenarios most of the times, which guerrilla seems successful, is actually that guerrilla is being defeated on the field. But that at a strategic level, and more than else at a political level, it requires some costs that the bigger guy is not interested in paying. Well, that's basically what the United States did in Vietnam, right? And that's why you lose wars, right? It's not because of guerrilla, right? It's not because, there's the tactical formula you can't truly defeat, right? There is also this obsession, frankly, of the it comes from this suggestions of Far East Asia. I don't know. It really has to do with not maybe just with the Vietnam War, but with a lot of bit of involvement of the Westerners, especially the United States and Far East Asia, where in countries that historically produced things like military, some strategic cultures and manuals, and attributing to them this Eastern finesse and wisdom and deep up. We had von Clausewitz in the West, but even so, we started, with Thucydides and Xenophon, right? What did the East have? Are you kidding me? Do you know what Western military culture actually is? And the fact that the whole world does function with Western military culture, that even countries like China were studying von Clausewitz, that the whole thing here is, based on that, right? So these are the, I don't even know why I talk about these things, because they're not even military realities, right? Because who was in charge knew these things. It's literally cultural. It's, I don't know if it's a way to self-promote cheap rubbish books about this stuff, like, let's make a book, von Clausewitz versus Sun Tzu, right? You should simply burn every book that has even such a title, because it doesn't mean anything. Not because you should be burning books, but because it's useless. You could use it, I don't know, to clean your pavement or something, because that's not a thing. That's just once again the consequence of the gross and radical ignorance that permeates the masses in general and for people to exploit. But do not fall in these traps, right? Because they are utterly idiotic, and they're not good. They're not good collectively, right? It's not an individual failure. It's not what you personally think about it that matters, because guess what? What you personally think, the world actually doesn't give a freaking damn, right? You're insignificant compared to the rest of the world. The problem is when you individually spread these ideas on a lot of other people, and that starts making a difference in the world for real, right? And that's why I find very disturbing this, kind of popular unawareness and total disorientation relatively to these topics, because it's like, we could do much better just as a society, as a as polities, and just by knowing this, literally the ABC of strategic culture. And we don't even teach them in schools. Of course, we don't even, in fact, study the Vom Kriege. We don't even read the Vom Kriege. We don't even know what it is, right? We invented culturalism, right? We will surely win everything in the future, thanks to culturalism. Yeah, see how that ends. Actually, this is already ending. Hopefully, maybe not ending, but the disasters are being still produced. Because I suppose culturalism is literally, when you do not know anything, but let's start from something like so vague and so arbitrary, like what the cultural definitions and categorizations could be, that it's completely useless. Look at what human nature actually is, and then start seeing how that declines itself. But if you don't have that base, hence what von Clausewitz is saying here, what are you going to do? Right? My campaign against culturalism is not to say that culture is not important. Of course it is. What do we talk all this time about, all the various wars in the past, about history, and that's to perfect our knowledge. But if we don't have this solid structure, this solid backbone at the base, at the root, that tells you how to frame that information, it's useless. You can't even, in fact, start thinking that, I don't know, Sun Tzu is a pearl of military wisdom, right? And that, after all, we could even compare with von Clausewitz, but it's like comparing von Clausewitz with Pythagoras, right? In the same levels of intellectual development of an entire civilization. But aside from this, I repeat myself rather too much maybe on these things, but since I see that these videos are not watched by many, I hope that this information repeated here and there actually helps to spread more than on other videos. But going on, von Clausewitz writes, we have seen that the decision of a partial combat is nothing in itself, but that all partial combats only find their complete solution in the decision of the total combat. What here von Clausewitz is meaning by total it's like the decisive combat. In this translation, I presume, which is not great, it's fairly tell you the truth, one of the worst. I actually read it in 3 languages before making the video, so I'm able to somewhat to paraphrase and criticize a little bit. Here, total combat is referring in the translation to what von Clausewitz, thought what absolute war should be, essentially at the roots in a suspensed universe, ideal universe, right? So here the translator is stressing the fact, where the higher commitment, right, the most important engagement, the resolutive, the decisive one, let's say, always given the limits that we have given, in fact, to this definition. That is to say, the combat is always limited in this; it's never decisive, right? As von Clausewitz puts it, ironically but properly, the true decisive combat is the last one, right? Even if it's insignificant, but that's still what brings the enemy to give up in the end. But the point here is that there is this aggregative and disgregative vision von Clausewitz gives, in the sense of saying, what all the war is about is this strategic ballet fundamentally dotted with all these combats that all together transition into a new strategic meaning then to give to the campaign, and that determine the outcome, right? So this is properly what the deal is. That is to say, in strategy, if you really want to see this in a plastic way, consider that the more you divide, the more you're likely to in fact to split your forces and to make them become individually insignificant. So if you overwhelm and concentrate forces, then you the enemy piece by piece, right, you're basically bringing it to the decisive thing, either crush against the bulk of the enemy, or you take the enemy out one by one. In any case, piece by piece, if he has scattered them. We've seen how von Clausewitz is a fan, essentially, of the decisive fight. Like, every war, humanitarianly speaking, in terms of actually of loss of lives, is much better to be fought like immediately, with all the concentration of forces, to say, okay, this is over, right? It doesn't protect in time. Like, the reality is very different, as we notice. Look, I don't know about, in fact, we were talking about Vietnam, we were talking about Afghanistan, talking about Iraq, talking about Syria, Libya, Ukraine. Good examples of realities that could have been settled in a much different way had not the real world stood in the way, in the sense that politics, society, all mitigate absolute war, right? So it's not a choice, right? You can't choose to make the enemy come to terms immediately, because maybe on the long run, politically speaking, there is an interest to make otherwise. And that's also why properly we talk about the military art, something detached from first of all the military elements overall, right? It's more like the direction you have to give to it than anything, but especially the domination of politics over war in every given single moment, essentially and by definition, right? The fact that war is nothing without politics. There is not a single military action that is not dictated entirely by political will. That is to say, if politics wants, war does not exist, right? Which is not to say that conflict and the necessity to bring the resolution with violence can be eliminated. That is out of the question. The point is that every single time this happens, it's because there is a political will behind it, right? And this is not a rhetoric against politics per se. Politics is a serious thing, right? It has nothing to do whether you country you come from, whichever it is, because everybody complains about the same thing. It's more or less corrupted, politically speaking. The point is that politics works like that, and war works like that. In absolute terms, then how the individuals use this functions is their own business, right? Whichever the reason to fight is, right? And there can be huge, colossal differences, right? Just like the one that could stand between, I don't know, the Western Allies and the Nazis, just to make an example, because we're talking about moral stories here, right? As we have seen, war is mostly a clash between moral forces, in all sense. But von Clausewitz, right? Even this decision of the total combat, so this bringing all these forces together because of the resolutive, hopefully, clash, has only a relative meaning of many different gradations according as the force over which the victory has been gained forms a more or less great and important part of the whole. Right, so as we're saying right now, you may not find the the viable situation to solve the thing to one for all. Right, after all, duels are a bit like this, right? Either you kill me or I kill you, or we kill each other, individually. But for Clausewitz, remember that a duel is literally, a war is, literally a duel on a large scale, right? So the point is that what we may see as a terrible war, is just, compared to two individuals, is just another guy, shouting at another, causing a psychophysical reaction that maybe doesn't even evolve into physical direct physical harm, right? That in the reality of, let's say, the two guys are like two countries with 100 million inhabitants, translates, I don't know, into a war of 3,000 dead, right? So the point is that the two guys might have actually beat the hell out of them, even killed each other, but they likely, humans are not meant to do this, right? The humans are made just mostly to yell, to shout at each other at a distance, throw maybe some rocks and something, and then get away, right? Just some single individuals are driven and motivated and tempered and in the condition to go out there, cold blood, smash someone else's face or break his neck, right? And the thing is actually even more frictional, let's say, in the outer world out there, is enormously more difficult to command, unlike a human body can be done from his brain, right? So this is an important aspect of this whole theory. Don't underestimate it. So for Clausewitz is saying that the lost battle of a corpse may be repaired by the victory of the army, right? That is to say, if actually there are fights that can be saved, right? It's unlikely, especially at a tactical level, but it can happen. As Clausewitz here writes, even the lost battle of an army may not only be counterbalanced by the gain of a more important one, but converted into a fortunate event. He makes this example the 2 days of the Battle of Kulm, August the 29th and 30th, 1813. No one can doubt this, but it is just as clear that the weight of each victory, the successful issue of each total combat, is so much the more substantial, the more important the part conquered, and that therefore the possibility of repairing the loss by subsequent events diminishes in the same proportion. That is to say, the larger the forces you committed are lost, and the more difficult proportionally becomes to revert the distraction, right? And here we're talking about forces. Always remember, we're not talking number of men. Here we're talking about properly the forces involved, right? This is literally the Vom Kriege is a physical treatise, right? Von Clausewitz is massively influenced and evidently into the physical, achievements of his time. He realizes here how perfectly how the whole thing, firstly the moral force actually, and secondly the physical one is important. So here the forces committed, it's not just 200,000 men. Ask the Soviets in World War II, right? This is how much will there was behind to stand up once again, which is wholly in another matter, and really dominates most of the situation, right? So this is very important as well, because it makes you realize that there is a proportionality, of course, even to the efforts that you have put on the table, but on the basis of where they came from. That is to say, a military defeat is going to weigh, depending on what the politics in the society where that army came from, what really made the effort that entity really made to field those troops and to bring them to fight and die, and how much will they have when they're defeated, right? So so it's really much more difficult than it seems to revert an outcome in general, and a defeat, let's say better, because one does not need to revert it, but it really weighs. I mean, there is a physical component there that is lost by sheer, could say, second principle thermodynamic, right? The enormous resources you commit to do one thing either require much larger ones if you want to try to revert the situation, and that really requires a commitment that must be based on something much more meaningful, that makes sense, that is shared, that is accepted, right? And the thing instead may end up you're giving it up. And von Clausewitz writes, in another place we shall have to examine this more in detail, and so it suffices for the present to have drawn attention to the undubitable existence of this progression. Cool. So then von Clausewitz writes, if we now add lastly to these two considerations the third, which is that if the persistent use of forces in tactics always shifts the great result to the end of the whole act, law of the simultaneous use of the forces in strategy, on the contrary, lets the principal result, which need not be the final one, take place almost always at the commencement of the great whole act, that in these three results we have grounds sufficient to fight strategic reserves, always more superfluous, always more useless, always more dangerous, the more the general their destination. Very, very important. That is to say, in battle, at a tactical level, what you're basically trying to do is to deal with the situation in the measure in which it evolves, and you can have a control on. Therefore, you can use reserves, and you can't wait, to commit your full forces, because if you commit them and they're defeated, you're out of there. You have to run, right? And there is a collapse. You can't recollect anymore, and so the situation requires reserves per se. Strategy works completely the other way around. Once you have taken the decision, you have to commit as many forces as you have immediately, because that's really going to make the impact you need. That's going to be the punching dynamic that will allow you to make it in the end, right? And therefore committing, employing reserves at that point, if you have a reasonably clear view of where the enemy forces are, and you don't expect sudden surprises from concealed forces, is actually madness. I mean, it's something very dangerous, and it can't, as we will see now, it happened historically speaking exactly because of this incompetence of not realizing this dynamic, right? And it's really, von Clausewitz, as you hear, is very harsh against the use of a strategic reserve per se, given the general logic of war, because that is, for you, it's stupid, it's criminal. I mean, people are gonna die because of that. You're going to, and more than that actually, because you're going to be defeated, because defeats are sometimes much worse than death, right? And in their consequences. So the thing is, if you have to do this, if you've taken that strategic decision with all the responsibility that it entails, may be a wrong one, by the way, right? But you have to commit your whole forces to it, because you're more likely to win at that point. In that way, I mean. Then von Clausewitz writes more clearly, the point where the idea of a strategic reserve begins to become inconsistent is not difficult to determine. It lies in the supreme decision. Employment must be given to all the forces within the space of the supreme decision, and every reserve active force available, which is only intended for use after that decision, is opposed to common sense. Right, so he's actually repeating what he has already said in the previous paragraph, but this is exactly the point, right? Once you have to take the decision that is gonna solve the war, hopefully in your in your favor, maintaining a reserve in this sense at a strategic level doesn't make any sense, right? And the supreme decision is in this sense, of course, strategic, in the sense that, of course, it can, it does translate itself into combat, but it's taken strategically. So that requires that concentration of forces then eventually on the field you can use through reserves, but that you have for that combat committed anyway, right? And that happens at a strategic level. So then von Clausewitz writes, if therefore tactics has in its reserves the means of not only meeting unforeseen dispositions on the part of the enemy, but also of repairing that which never can be foreseen, the result of the combat, should that be unfortunate, strategy, on the other hand, must, at least as far as relates to the capital result, renounce to the use of these means. As a rule, it can only repair the losses sustained at a point by advantages gained at another, in a few cases by moving troops from one point to another. The idea of preparing for such reverses by placing in reserve beforehand can never be entertained in strategy. Again, right? The insistence of this is really important, and von Clausewitz explains why. Explains why, as he puts it in the end, he's not fighting against windmills. This is not just, cheap talk. This is actually a mistake that's been done countless times, and it actually brought to the ruin of his own country, Prussia. As he writes, we have pointed out as an absurdity the idea of a strategic reserve which is not to cooperate in the capital result. And as it is so beyond a doubt, we should not have been led into such an analysis as we have made in these two chapters, were it not that, in the disguise of other ideas, it looks like something better and frequently makes its appearance. One person sees in the Acma of strategic sagacity and foresight. Another rejects it, and with it the idea of any reserve, consequently even of a tactical one. This confusion of ideas is transferred to real life, and if we would see a memorable instance of it, we have only to call to mind Prussia in 1806, left a reserve of 20,000 men cantoned in the Mark under Prince Eugene of Württemberg, which could only not possibly reach the Saale in time to be of any use, and that another force of 25,000 men belonging to this power remained in East and South Prussia, destined only to be put out on a war footing afterwards as a reserve. After these examples, we cannot be accused of having been fighting with windmills, and I don't think this requires an explanation. But just to stress, the fact that these are real things. Like, these mistakes really make a real difference, right? Have really brought entire countries to their knees, if not worse. And this can be observed in so many different situations, and it goes without saying that, as we have seen previously, most of this stuff has really to do with how the political commitment is really functioning. Like, right, the idea of bringing troops on the field, on the strategic field, is something that not everywhere has been so unanimous and clear, and this naturally reflects once again a degree of political fragmentation, if you want, that also produce different results in other ways, to counterbalance the fragmentation in other ways. But in general, when we bring it to the strictly strategic level and tactical one as well, there has been someone who has basically not even drawn the distinction between what happens in strategy, what happens in tactics, with reserves, right? And that said, either to use them always in both dimensions, or not to use them, right? And therefore causing enormous disasters that could have been averted. And this is really important because it's not just about the the side you're fighting for. I mean, it's that is apparently the most important thing. But this has overall in the World War actually the effect. I mean, as a mistake, actually, to kill more human lives than what a more direct commitment in this regard. More, first of all, this realization of how the reserves function differently in tactics and in strategy. But secondly, properly of the realization that how the thing should work in both dimensions in order to make the war stop earlier. Right? The reality is, though, is that politics may not want that, and it may have actually its own good reasons for it. Right? But once again, this is not something to be determined just magically because you either want it or not want it. This thing must be known because they're at the base of every strategic education. These are things that someone had to get through the Napoleonic era to write them down, literally in this case. Today we teach them in military academies, but we are still we have still to be prepared in the actual experience of it, in the actual study of military history that unfortunately is lacking in the same military academies that give this kind of teachings, but maybe do not effectively analyze that in a multiplicity of cases, like a constant study of first of all, an exercise of command should give first and foremost, right? But secondly, also a military historical education, which is what at least what in the civilian world we can do instead, and at least to compensate a bit. What that means, even if we had no effective experience of command, but let's say making us understand how this is really relatable, also in other aspects of life, and how therefore war fits in it with its own characteristics, but still essentially in the same way as other human activities. So anyhow, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.